Thank you very much indeed, everybody. Okay, thank you for the questions. We'll go through those to this panel in a moment, but there is one question upon safety which I'll take first. I'm going to ask Robert Patterson, who is the Oil and Gas UK Safety Director, to answer this. Robert, the question is, a UK union representative was interviewed on BBC News yesterday. He cited the Norwegian offshore helicopter service as being an example of best industry practice and safety record. Is he correct? And should the UK be learning from our neighbours in the North Sea oil and gas industry? Your thoughts on that, Robert?
I think my first thought is really that there's a lot of speculation going around in the industry, on Twitter, on social media networks about the cause of this latest incident. And we actually have no idea what went wrong. We don't know that it's a mechanical problem. We don't know whether there was an avionics issue. We don't know whether there's another soft issue involved here. So it'd be entirely wrong to add to that speculation. The flight data recorder is currently sitting on the seabed off the south coast of the Shetlands. So until we get that information back, until the pilots have been interviewed, we're not in a position where we can actually say whether there's what the issue is here. Certainly, I know in terms of the UK CAA, the Norwegian CAA, they liaise regularly. They have common standards set by the European Aviation Safety Agency. So the standards are very, very similar throughout Europe as a result of having this whole European-wide agency. The same operating companies the helicopter operating companies work out of Norway. They have similarly trained pilots, similarly trained engineers to maintain those helicopters. So I would suggest that the standards that we have in the UK are very similar to those elsewhere in Europe, and certainly similar to those in Norway.
Thanks very much indeed, Robert. Thanks. Okay, well, the balance of the questions are really for the broad panel, and I'm very pleased to welcome onto the panel Una Werngren, who is at the far end there. Hi, Una. Una, is there anything that you would like to sort of reflect on the economic report, or what you've heard on that before we go to the others? Sorry, that's really, I know I've really bounced you with that, haven't I? But yeah. Is there anything you want to say?
Over the last 6 months, it's become apparent that we do have quite a significant issue with production. And therefore, we've actually put in place a number of different groups who are looking at what we need to do in this space. So the reflections are real. There are activities going on in support of that, but in truth, it's how we get from management recommendations at a very high level through to the 55,000 people who work offshore and actually make it a reality that is perhaps one of our biggest challenges. So nobody here should underestimate what it's going to take us to turn production round. This isn't a light switch that we can turn on. It's going to require a concerted effort in a number of different areas, from investment, in terms of individual commitment, in terms of knowing and understanding what the data is telling us, and actually planning a response that will take a considerable period of time. We've now set some very specific targets around production efficiency. We are identifying, both at an operator level and a field level, where the industry sits, and we are planning to encourage people over a period of the next 3 to 5 years to actually get back to a very high level of production efficiency, which we hope will make a difference. But we should not underestimate the scale of the task that we have ahead of us.
Thanks very much indeed, and I'm sorry that was a bit unfair of me, really. Tina, this next question is, first question is for you. At the start of your talk, you referred briefly to a fragmented supply chain. What would you prefer to see, and why would this be better for the industry in the UK?
Thank you, and thank you for the question. In terms of the term fragmented, I think it is right that there will continue to be a huge diversity within supply chains. The key really that we're looking for is that those supply chains understand their connections, they are mapped, the connections are known, and critical supply partners recognise that role and recognise that dependency. So in fact, it's a joined up supply chain rather than one operating in silos and individual agendas. And that's something we believe that this industry and others are confronted with as quite a significant task.
Thanks very much. David, is there anything you would want to add on that?
Well, it always strikes me when you get into this kind of debate that you bump into competitive forces, proprietary rights technologies, and it's something which on the face of it is highly desirable, but there are forces, natural forces at work which push you in the fragmented direction. And it's actually trying to identify where cooperation can pay whilst remaining competitive and clearly within the law, because one has to be slightly careful that you don't cross the boundary and find that the competition people start wagging their fingers at you. So it's highly desirable, but jolly difficult to do, frankly. Thanks,
David. Right, Adam, out of the 300 billion to recover, out of the 300 billion pounds to recover 11 million barrels BOEs, you said about 30 to 40 billion are in respect of decommissioning costs. Shouldn't the design of new installations allow for cheaper decommissioning than 10% of the total spend?
Well, the first thing I'd say on decommissioning is that decommissioning cost estimates are very hard to put in place at the moment because as an industry we've got very little experience of decommissioning to date. And one thing we do find is that year on year there are big changes for both individual fields and the industry as a whole for decommissioning expectations in terms of cost. In terms of making assets cheaper to be decommissioned, it's not something I can say an awful lot on at the moment, I'm afraid. I mean, I don't know if David's got anything to say on the matter.
Well, I think first and foremost, we've got a huge stock of kit out there about whose design we can do absolutely zilch as far as decommissioning is concerned. And at the moment, that's where the really big costs are. So, yeah, I'm sure that future designs will build upon the knowledge that we have, but as Adam says, in decommissioning terms, relatively modest. But nonetheless, we have to recognise the enormity of the, if you like, the dead weight, as it were, of the kit that is out there already.
Una, have you got any thoughts on this? Could we get smarter on cost, do you think, over time?
I think we absolutely can. I think it's an area that we just haven't been challenged on, quite frankly. But as we recognise these costs as we go forward, we certainly need to be thinking about that in the design stage. And there's an awful lot of work going on in this area at the moment. Lifting, cutting technologies that we're having to apply at the moment are giving us grounds to think about how many vessels we'll need in the future. And a lot of this information will be put in the conference at St Andrews that is going to occur on the 2nd and 3rd of October. And at that event, we'll be presenting the latest update on the decom survey that we've done this year. So we continue to grow in knowledge in this area, but I fundamentally agree that we need to plan more now for the future.
Okay, thanks very much. David, I think this one's for you. The European policy triangle, the energy policy triangle, looks very outdated against the current energy mix. Contrast coal consumption growth and the shale boom. What do we need to do to shift the emission obsession to a more balanced, sustainable set of priorities? There's a nice one for you, David.
How many hours have I got? I mean, interestingly, the event which has shifted matters more than anything else has been the recession across Europe over the years since the financial crisis really struck in late 2008. And we saw the very sharp downturn in 2009 and, of course, the struggling recovery. I don't think there's anything else which has adjusted perceptions as much as that has. And it's certainly adjusted perceptions in London and perhaps even more so in Brussels. There is far more talk now at the policy level about the affordability and therefore the consequences for economic competitiveness of the whole policy. When the policy was put in place, of course, which was back in boom times, the European meeting in March 2007 was probably the defining moment more than any others. The question of cost, I'm afraid, was not properly considered, and security of supply was almost an automatic assumption. And the events in North America, I think, just demonstrate so clearly how difficult it is to predict the future and how potentially dangerous it is to set policies which are unduly rigid. Policies do need to be hugely flexible in order to adjust to events. And the trouble is, a lot of this stuff is now enshrined in legislation, both at a European level and at a domestic level. At a domestic level, it's our own Climate Change Act 2008, which sets so much of this. And my personal belief is some of that legislation is going to have to be unpicked and reset. And I hope it is reset with much greater flexibility in mind because of our inability to predict the future. And if you want a really vivid example of that here, so much of the current policy here unfortunately rests on an assumption that fossil fuel prices will forever go on upwards. And that seems to me a flawed assumption. I simply do not see how you can build and justify a policy on the back of that kind of assumption. Because events, dear boy, events, as Harold Macmillan famously said when he was Prime Minister, soon turn round and bite you.
There you go. Well done, David. Thank you very much indeed. Tina, this question's for you. What are the leading indicators of a company's resilience?
That's a nice, easy one at this time of the day.
Yeah.
I wish I could give you the top...
You've got 15 minutes. Carry on.
I was going to say, I'm assuming there's more questions, so I can't have the floor for the same time again. I wish I could give you the list of top 10, but unfortunately, whoever asked the question and others, I can't really give you that. But let me perhaps try and reflect on a couple of thoughts. In terms of the leading indicators of resilience, one of the things that is absolutely common is that people don't have any indicators. Let me turn that around. They have indicators a little bit about what we've done, so what we've produced, what we've invested. They have very few indicators about how they've done it. And that is around questions, for example, around decision-making, the speed of decision-making, whether or not those decisions have had to be changed. There's also indicators around internal within the organisation. A very key issue that we see at the moment is indicators around competency and whether the right talent is getting promoted into the right positions. There's a huge number of questions of that at the leadership level, as I inferred in the presentation. And at the moment, people are quite shy about indicators about themselves, how they work internally. their structures, their competencies, and there are some very, very key and we believe missing indicators in that respect. And the other side of it, if we're not focusing on indicators that are more of an internal nature, is the indicators that are an external nature. And I'll come back to supply chain perhaps as an example. And this is around indicators around the quality of relationships. Now, I'm a scientist by background. I don't do really soft and fluffy stuff. The quality of relationships is really looking at the effectiveness of those relationships, their response times to your requests, your negotiations with them, their ability to follow through, particularly in crisis situations. So those are the indicators. I can't really do it justice, but those indicators, I guess, just to summarize in light of time, is really the indicators that are about you as organizations, how you operate, how you work, and then looking at the indicators around actually how that translates into some of the external factors. I hope that perhaps gives a flavour.
No, great. I think it's very important what you say about how did you get that result is hugely important too. I'll bore everybody with a reflection from when I was a young manager and I was on a team leading, team exercise in the field, and I was given charge of a team, and we had a very, very difficult task to undertake, and we achieved the task. We achieved it with about a minute to spare, but we achieved it by me barking orders at everybody in this team and turning them into complete functionaries. And when we reflected back on this, what we'd done is I'd succeeded in achieving the task, but I completely destroyed the team. And it was a very interesting reflection. Okay, with increased OPEX per barrel and levels of CapEx required in the UKCS increasing, what effect do you think fracking will have on this investment, on the investment required and future production? So I guess I'd interpret that as saying, we've got a few problems in the offshore, and then there's this potential miracle onshore coming, is there? What impacts do we see? Una, should we start with you, and then we'll go to David on that one, shall we?
Assuming we can get over the numerous people who are objecting to fracking in the short term, I still think that we are probably 10 or 15 years away from any major impact of fracking, if indeed it does take off in the UKCS. During that time, we still have some significant projects to deliver. We have some significant decisions to make as an industry about how we continue to invest in some of our older infrastructure. And I see that we're potentially on a cusp as we come into the sort of 2020s about whether we're going to walk away from significant parts of the North Sea because they're no longer economic to invest in, or whether we're actually going for a major rejuvenation project to invest in infrastructure because we believe that there are significant barrels left in the North Sea. And as we go forward, as David said, depending on where we end up with the relative price of oil and gas, I think that will also play a part in terms of how successful the onshore fracking is relative to the offshore industry.
Yeah, thanks, Una. David, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah. Onshore this country, there are about 2,000 oil and gas wells, and of course they're in conventional reservoirs, of which some 200 have been hydraulically fractured. Again, of course, I emphasize conventional oil and gas reservoirs. So despite the protests, the reality is there's quite a number of wells onshore which have gone through the same process, albeit not in the unconventional geology that is involved in this gas exploration that we're talking about. Una's right, it's not going to happen quickly. Will it affect investment offshore? I would doubt it. Potentially, of course, the sums of investment are quite big, but they're nowhere near on that scale now, and it's going to take years if they ever get there. Will hydraulic fracturing in unconventional geological formations go ahead? My guess is yes. I think one of Tina's graphs with all those nice high-risk elements, I think this is one of those ones you could say was at the left-hand end of the scale. It's hit things very quickly, or back to Harold Macmillan events, dear boy. My belief is it will be overcome. It probably more likely to happen somewhere in the north than the south of England initially, and we will move on. Will it affect the price of gas, I'm sometimes asked, and the answer is it's almost impossible to predict, but all you do know is that any increase in supply will tend to have a downward pressure on prices. But it's all a question of volume and timing and the state of the market as and when it happens. So a lot to play for. I doubt that it will divert investment funds, certainly in the sort of time horizons we're talking about here, away from the UKCS.
Thanks very much, David. I'm going to combine the last two questions, and we're going to get into the Una show, I think, because they're really for you, Una. I think these are around the pilot and what's going on there. So can you give us a bit more information on the pilot initiatives, what it's trying to achieve and by when, and including what's going on around production efficiency? And somebody else has asked on what is exactly being done to increase exploration and appraisal in the UKCS, and so you might like to say a few words about the exploration task force, because I know you're involved in all of that, Una. So can you give us your thoughts?
This is another one that could take all morning.
You've got 5 minutes.
Great. Okay. If we start with exploration, and Adam referred earlier to the fact that we've got this challenge, both in terms of the number of wells we're drilling and their actual success rate. So economic success was only 17% last year. And there is a very strong feeling amongst the exploration managers that part of that reason is that we're doing what we call postage stamp interpretations. In the past, major companies have done significant work around hydrocarbon play fairways, where they really understood the key elements of what goes into making a reservoir successful. And that mapping hasn't occurred of late on the kind of scale that it needs to generate significant success. So we're looking at a number of different ways of tackling that. One is through an update of the Millennium Atlas, which is effectively the Bible of where the hydrocarbon plays exist. It was developed in 2002 or 3 for the northern and central North Sea. It's come out more recently for the southern North Sea, but it's never been looked at all for the west of Shetlands. So there's certainly a lot of work we can do in that area in terms of trying to work out how the industry comes together to generate significant hydrocarbon play fairway maps that will be of value to all operators. Coupled with that, we're looking at where are the new areas of the basin that require significant seismic shoots? Should they be underpinned by government or by industry? And could that encourage new people to invest in the basin? We're also looking, though, at what are the lessons that we've learned in the last 5 years. If we haven't been particularly successful, can we organise a conference, which we're now doing at the end of January, called Pitfalls, in exploration, whereby we learn the lessons of how people started to drill a particular trend, potentially drilled dry wells, and then made it successful. So in the whole area, we're looking at increasing the knowledge and understanding of what's been going on in the basin and how we can therefore encourage more people to drill successfully as we go forward. The next area that we're looking at is EOR, Enhanced Oil Recovery. This work is being led by BP at the moment, whereby in order to move a program like this forward, you actually need to do a lot of core study, a lot of analysis of rocks and data. And at the moment, individual fields and individual companies are doing this work. when in truth we have a number of reservoirs in the UKCS that are actually fundamentally the same. So how can we share data so that not everybody has to do exactly the same core test on the same similar piece of rock? And how can we therefore get investment in EOR schemes like LOSAL that's now being put on Clare actually applied to brownfield installations? So a lot of work going on in that area. Another area is rejuvenation. So last year we did a lot of work around infrastructure, around criticality of infrastructure, and where the remaining resources are in the North Sea. We've actually moved ahead quite significantly on a project that's now being kicked off between Cormorant and Magnus. In that area of the northern North Sea, we are writing to all operators to encourage them to participate in a project that has been underwritten by Oil and Gas UK, where we will employ a third party, which is actually Dundas, who will do an analysis of both all the project's potential drilling, potential developments in that area, relative to the current infrastructure that exists. And rather than generate individual views around a particular platform or hub of what could be possible, stand back and say, what's the UK PLC view? If I owned all of this, what are those projects that I would do? Where do I need to ensure that there's joint exploration or appraisal? Where could I combine effort? Where do I need fuel gas? Ask all these questions that would potentially unlock the basin in a very different way. Once we've got that and we've actually identified the size of the prize, then we will overlay the current commercial and technical blockers and ask the question, how do we actually realise this prize? So I think that's quite an exciting piece of work. And that project is literally being kicked off at the moment. As David said, there's lots of competition law issues if you try and get the industry to work together. We're trying to overcome them by getting a third party to do the analysis. But we hope that we can put back into the industry next year some really tangible projects that would make that area very significant. A similar piece of work is going on.
Sorry, just 1 minute now. Can you wrap?
Okay, in the central North Sea, not quite as far advanced. And then production efficiency, I talked about earlier, a lot of work going on there to look at how do we get from the current 60% production efficiency back up to 80 in effectively 3 years. And we're looking at how we manage TARs as an industry, wrench time, unplanned losses and shutdowns, and some human factors around behaviours which are important in that area. So,
thanks very much indeed. That was really a bit of a tour de force. And if anybody has got any other questions for Una, I know she'll be pleased to answer them, and please do let her know. But I think we must conclude matters there. It's time to let you go on about your business. Could you please join me now in thanking all our speakers and panellists. The only reward they're going to get, please, your appreciation. If we could just thank them again.